If you wanted to buy another £12,500 of income from a private pension, you would need to save around about £250,000 in order to buy that same level of that the state pension is going to give you. So it's a lot of money you need to put away.
This episode is sponsored by Saxo Markets. Hello and welcome to the Investing Insiders podcast, where we help you achieve financial well-being by making smarter money decisions. I'm Brianne, and in this episode, we'll be diving into some of the challenges that can occur when you're building up enough to cover you throughout retirement, and some of the steps you can take to make sure you can afford the lifestyle that you want. Joining us today is Pete Glancy, Head of Pension Policy at Scottish Widows. Pete, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me along, Brianne.
Amazing. Well, this is a really good topic to dig into. So, thinking about making sure that you have enough for retirement can seem very abstract. It's quite difficult to kind of put it into terms what you need and what making sure you have enough for the lifestyle that you want looks like. So thinking about people who might not have enough or at risk of not having enough when they hit retirement age, what do the figures say?
Well, most people, I think, understand that the state pension, it's the best known source of retirement income. And if you spend 35 years in employment paying national insurance contributions, you would build up entitlement to a full state pension. That's around £12,500 per annum at the moment. If you retire as a couple, and both of you have that full career history, you'd have £25,000 a year coming in. Not everyone, of course, retires as a couple, so you need to bear in mind, how do you think you're going to retire? Now, to give you an illustration of how much money you need to put into a private pension to buy that same level of income, if you wanted to buy another £12,500 of income from a private pension, you would need to save around about £250,000 in order to buy that same level of that the state pension is going to give you. So it's a lot of money you need to put away.
Absolutely. And in terms of people who are maybe not on track to hitting those figures, are we all generally, heading in the right direction? Or is there like a chunk of the population that might not actually reach that when they hit retirement age?
Well, Scottish Widows, we conduct a massive programme of research each year. We survey 6,000 representative members of the British public, all walks of life and financial circumstances. And from what they tell us, we're able to predict the nation's preparedness for retirement. What we can see is around about a third of the population who are going to be quite comfortable when they retire, and they tend to be in well-paid full-time jobs for most of their working lives. You've then got around about a third of the population who have a very basic standard of living in retirement. They will be able to make ends meet, but there won't be any luxuries. They may not be able to continue to run a car. They may struggle to go on any foreign holidays at all. But unfortunately, we've also got around about a third of the population who won't even have enough to make that basic standard of living in retirement. They will need to think about working much later in life, potentially, than they want to. And they will also have to, rely on benefits, hoping that the country's still in good enough shape in the decades to come to be able to afford all of the benefits that the population might need.
That's quite a significant sum. And it potentially does open your eyes a little bit to the number of people who, just aren't necessarily putting enough away. What are some of the reasons why people might underestimate what they're putting into their pension, particularly if, say, they're already auto-enrolled or, they have a workplace pension where money's coming out? Could people in that position still be at risk of undersaving as well?
Oh, definitely. I think there's an assumption that if you've been auto-enrolled into a workplace pension, everything will be okay. People have seen their parents and their grandparents retiring. They've had a state pension, they've had a workplace pension, and they seem to be doing okay. But some of the pensions that those older generations retired with were final salary pensions, defined benefit pensions that gave you often 2/3 of the salary that you retired on. So they were very generous. Across the private sector, pretty much entirely in the entirety of the private sector, those final salary pensions don't exist anymore. So your pension is based on how much you and your employer put into what's known as a defined contribution pension. And the pension pots that they deliver are nowhere near as generous. So, for example, if you wanted to buy yourself the level of income that you would have traditionally had from a final salary scheme, between you and your employer, you would need to be putting about 30% of your salary for every year of your working life into a pension. Through auto-enrollment, the statutory level of savings is just 8%. So it's about a quarter of that amount. So the money going into DC pensions isn't going to buy you the sort of retirement incomes that you maybe saw your parents and your grandparents having.
That's quite a significant difference, 30 versus 8%. I guess anybody listening to those figures at the moment, might be thinking, well, what can I do? There is the statutory amount of auto enrollment going out. And is there anything that you can action to maybe try and increase that if you can afford to?
Yes, so there's a number of things you can do. The last Retirement Commission ran between 2002 and 2006. And it gave us auto-enrollment, which was implemented between 2012 and 2017. And ever since then, most of us who are employed are contributing to a workplace pension. The level of savings at the time, when combined with the state pension, was designed to keep people out of poverty. There was an assumption that education, engagement, guidance and advice would encourage people to think about the additional amount that they would need to save on a voluntary basis, and that a lot of people would do that. It's that extra bit that hasn't happened. People haven't been engaged. People haven't saved any extra. So a few top tips. The first thing to think about is when you're young, you want to be thinking about pensions a bit like snowballs. If you roll a snowball down a hill, the longer it rolls, the bigger it gets. Pension contributions are a bit like that, with the compound growth from the investment return, so that a pound that you put in your early 20s will buy you 4 times as much retirement income as a pound you put in your late 50s. So if you can afford to put more in when you're young, it's worth doing it, even if you're on a smaller salary. The second thing to think about is that many employers, especially larger employers, will offer matched contributions and tiered levels of contributions. So you may be auto-enrolled at just 8%, but you can speak to your employer, and many of the larger employers especially will say, well, if you put a bit more in, we will also put a bit more in, and you can boost that contribution up to 12 or 15 or something higher if your employer operates an arrangement like that. So it's worth checking. And the third thing to do is to look at the level of volatility and risk. There are different ways in which your pension pot can be invested. So if you're taking a bit more investment risk, which normally gives a higher return in the long term, the value of your pension can go up and down over time. That's called volatility. Now, you don't want volatility when you're getting older and you're close to retirement, in case you're retiring at a trough in that volatility, you'll have a smaller pension pot. But when you're in your 20s and 30s, it doesn't really matter if the fund's going up and down a bit, if over the longer term it's giving you a higher level of return. So there's calculators that are available through your employer's site, through your pension scheme or provider's site, that help you understand your attitude to risk. And if you're younger, you've got a higher attitude to risk, it might be worth having a look at that.
I think it's great to hear the different tools and other things that are available to make sure that you get an understanding of where you're at, regardless of whether or not you've checked your pension before and it's completely new, or you're just trying to keep on top of it and take a look. From the research that Scottish Widows has done and anything else that you've read, are there any types of people in the workforce, or potentially who are self-employed, that are at greater risk of being underpensioned potentially?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. There's a very strong correlation between people who have well-paid full-time jobs for the majority of their career and good pension outcomes. So by definition, if you don't have that, you're going to have a poorer outcome. So we see women, for example, we issue a women in retirement report each autumn. Women are more likely to take time out of their careers to bring up children or look after elderly relatives, and those career breaks mean that they have a smaller pension when they come to retire. People who have part-time jobs, there's an earnings trigger of £10,000. If you're not earning at least that, you don't get auto-enrolled, you don't get any pension contributions. And some people who are earning more than the average national wage are doing so between 2 or 3 part-time jobs. And it might be that those part-time jobs on their own, none of them are triggering the 10K contribution. But you can ask to be auto-enrolled if you are earning below 10K. So that's worth thinking about if you've got a number of jobs and you're not set up for a pension. And you did mention it, the self-employed. There's 4.5 million self-employed people in the UK at the moment. So auto-enrollment's been very successful in getting employed people into pensions. The system is really driven by payroll. So payroll systems that employers operate calculate how much you've earned, turn that from a percentage into a contribution and send it off to a pensions company. The self-employed don't have payroll systems. There isn't an ecosystem that would easily drive an equivalent of auto-enrollment for the self-employed. But we're certainly working with government and others to say, how can we build a similar ecosystem to auto-enrollment, but it will need to be tailored to meet the very specific needs of the self-employed.
Absolutely, because I guess with being self-employed and being an entrepreneur, there is that variation of income. So it's not as if you could say a certain amount could come out each month. Things could vary quite significantly. For people who are self-employed and thinking, okay, I really do want to make sure I set myself up for later life, what are some of the accounts or just processes that they can put in place to make sure that they're putting money aside and building that retirement pot for a comfortable, life when they hit pension age?
Well, the self-employed don't have auto-enrollment. Auto-enrollment applies to employees. And I guess the self-employed are probably more employers. It's a person that employs himself, basically. So they don't have employees as such. The way it works for employed people is you're either paid weekly or you're paid monthly, and you kind of budget on that basis. And your pension contributions are kind of worked out, based on your weekly and monthly budgets. But the self-employed often don't know how much they've got to play with for the longer term until the year end, until they've settled up corporation tax and VAT and the like and other expenses. So we need a different way of thinking about the self-employed. You don't have to use workplace pensions, of course. There are personal pensions and SIPs which are available to the self-employed. And the pensions tax wrapper is still the most tax efficient in the long term if you're saving purely for retirement. What we also know about the self-employed, though, is that their personal finances and their business finances are much more likely to be completely intertwined. And the self-employed tell us that they can't always afford to lock up a very large amount of their capital, until age 55. They often want to put it into savings or investment vehicles, which give them access in the shorter or medium term if they get, left field bills coming in, etc. And so we probably need to think about a combination of products for the self-employed, savings and investment vehicles that give them some flexibility, combined with pensions vehicles, which are the best from the tax relief perspective.
Absolutely. I think having that tailored approach would help to make sure that all bases are covered, particularly, as you mentioned, having flexibility with cash flow, because you never quite know how things are going to be, regardless of projections and how you might plan for your year to go. If you are self-employed, things change and you need that access pretty quickly if you can.
Yes, yeah.
This episode of the Investing Insiders podcast is sponsored by Saxo Markets. Saxo provides access to a broad range of global assets through a sophisticated trading platform. You can trade US stocks from as little as $1 per trade and UK stocks from $3 per trade. Please remember that all investing involves risk. The value of your investments can go down as well as up, and you could get back less than you invest. Terms and conditions apply. Visit Saxo Markets to learn more. As we kind of touched upon with some of the groups, particularly if you are going to be taking time out of work to start a family, or if potentially you need to take time out of work to care for family and things like that, what are some of the mechanisms that you can put in place to make sure that you keep your pension topped up, or you just kind of don't abandon it altogether just to try and fill that gap?
Well, some of this is down to individuals and some of it's down to employers. I mean, there's nothing stopping, employers continuing to put some money into someone's pension, while they're taking out for maternity leave, for example. If you are thinking of having a family, say in your late 20s into your 30s, that snowball effect is very important. Try and get as much money as you can into a pension during your late teens through your 20s, because if you save a bit excessively there, you're getting ahead of the game, and the compound investment returns will compensate. Obviously, there's a sort of cultural thing that men and women should be sharing the load of caring for children and for elderly relatives more evenly. That's getting into relationships rather than pensions. I'm not qualified to talk about relationships, but there is a thing there for employers in terms of the culture that is often seen as culturally unacceptable for a man to go along and say, "Well, I want to take 6 or 12 months out because I've started a family." It does seem that employers seem to see it as more culturally acceptable if a woman come along and says that. So we do need employers to change their attitudes to all of this as well. And the last thing is on the state pension side of things. There was a change made, or I think it was just shortly after the last Pensions Commission, which allows people who are taking time out of employment for caring duties to continue to accrue entitlement towards a state pension. Now, if you're on a carer's allowance, the mechanics that happen within government behind the scenes should automatically trigger And if you're qualifying for childcare, you should automatically get those credits allocated to you. But if you're a better off household and you're maybe not in receipt of some of those benefits, there's a form that you need to fill in. So if you are taking time out for caring duties, whether it's childcare or elderly relatives, make sure that you're building up your entitlements to the state pension, because for most people, the state pension will make up the majority of the retirement income.
That's a really important point to flag. I think making sure that the foundational or quite a big proportion of the income is covered. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure you're getting the credits that build towards the qualifying years you mentioned earlier, so that you do get the full entitlement when you reach state pension age. I think sometimes when talking about pensions, the state pension is obviously a huge focus. And I think a lot of people do recognize that it plays a big part in their retirement income in later life. For those who might be thinking, okay, I can just rely on the state pension, what are some of the things that they should consider if that is their retirement strategy?
Well, the biggest one, of course, is, are you going to be retiring as part of a couple in a whatever form of relationship you're in, or are you going to be retiring on your own? Because two state pensions goes a long way to covering your household, the cost of running a household, buying food, essentials like that, etc. And if you've only got one state pension, it's going to be an awful lot tougher. So and of course, not everybody can correctly predict. You might be intending to retire as part of a couple, and something terrible happens to one of you in the relationship. So these things aren't guaranteed. But if you are thinking you're going to be retiring on your own, you really need to be thinking about much more seriously about the private pension side of things. The other thing to take into account is housing equity. There's an awful lot of people who won't have enough in their pension pots to get them through retirement. But many millions of us who won't have enough in our pension will have a fair amount of housing equity. And I think increasingly people are going to need to release some of the equity in their home to help them get through retirement. Now, that could be in the form of downsizing from a big house to a smaller house, and you obviously you can use the difference to fund your retirement, or it could be through products which allow you to unlock some of the equity in your home whilst you continue to live there to top up your pension income. People don't like to think about tapping into the equity in their home, but I think increasingly it may be necessary for many people.
So for anybody who potentially is thinking about using their property to, fund part of their pension, you mentioned downsizing. What are some of the products that they could also consider to release, extra value that they can use throughout their retirement years?
We're getting into the sort of territory of lifetime mortgages and equity release. And the FCA, this country's financial regulator, is having a look at those products at the moment to make sure that they represent good value for money and that they're being distributed in the right way. That hasn't always been in the case in the past. We know that there's some poor value products in the past, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And as the nation is more likely to start to do this again, the regulator wants to make sure people get a good deal. So they've got that work on the go at the moment. But there's basically two shapes of product. One shape of product is where you take an amount out of equity in your home. You just pay the interest on that, almost like a bit like a loan. And when you come to retire, the amount that you borrowed is still the amount that you will owe, and that will come out of your estate when you eventually pass away. If you're thinking about your home as a way of passing on wealth to the next generation and to your kids, you've got a good feel for the fact, because you're paying the interest, the amount that you borrowed and the amount that you owe will be the same number, so you know how much is going to get passed on to the kids. The other way of doing it is to take out the lump sum, but you don't really have the headroom to be paying interest on top of your other bills, in which case the interest rolls up on the amount that you've borrowed. So let's say you borrow 200,000. If the interest is rolling up, it might be in 10 or 15 years' time, if you pass away, that that you owe 300,000, very crude as an example. So a larger amount would come out of your estate. And what you need to be thinking about there is the value of my home likely to be rising faster than the interest rate on the equity release product? And if it is, in real terms, your kids are still going to get the same inheritance. But if the growth in house prices is less than the interest rate that you're paying on that financial product, then it will be eating into the amount that's going to get passed on to the kids. So there's two flavours of how you could take money out through financial products. You need to think about which is right for you.
Absolutely. And I think also taking a step backwards and looking at property and the part that it could play in your pension planning and financial planning in retirement. How important then is it to kind of prioritize home ownership before heading into your retirement years?
Well, all of the calculations that the industry's done for the last 20 or 30 years and the government continues to do, when we're working out savings rates and contribution rates for pensions, we all assume that it's still the 1970s, that either people have paid off their mortgage when they retire or they're living in a council house. Now, neither of those things are true for everyone anymore. We sold off the council houses, and it's very difficult for people to get on the property ladder these days and own their own home. So it's much more common for people to be renting private rentals all the way through their retirement. And because people are getting onto the property ladder so late in life, they're carrying mortgages through their 60s and 70s and 80s. And the amount that we're saving for retirement was never designed to be paying mortgages right through to your 80s or to be paying very high private rents. If I give you an example in private rents, the average private rent in the northeast of England is 80% of the average pension income. In the south of England, it's 100% of the average pension income. And London is about 120% of the average pension income. So as we see more and more people renting in retirement, people just won't be able to make ends meet. So when you're in the earlier part of your life, you need to think about how am I going to get a balanced strategy to get onto the property ladder and hopefully have a home that I can live in without huge housing costs through retirement, and alongside that build up a reasonable pension pot. The people who will get into trouble will be the people who do all of one or all of the other. Because if you concentrate only on your pension, you will have a big pension, but all of that money is going to go on private rent. So that kind of defeats the purpose. And if you've ploughed all of your money into a big house, you're not going to have the income, to keep that house going when you come to retire. So it's all about getting a balance, not overstretching yourself on one or the other.
That is so interesting. And I think, thank you so much for kind of breaking down what the rental cost implication on your pension could be at the moment. I think it's difficult sometimes to conceptualize, okay, well, what do these costs actually mean in real terms? But thinking about how much you need to balance all of these different things and make sure you've got enough to see you through is so crucial. How far do you think the current system goes in helping people achieve that balance? We obviously have auto enrollment and, hopefully changes do come into place for those who are self-employed as well. But looking at all of these different things that you do have to think about, how well does the system right now help people recognize that and action it?
The current system is hopeless, but there are plans afoot to make it a lot better. There's a few ingredients. So the first thing is that people really don't know how much they have in their pension is what they're on track for. So we think the latest estimate is that early next year, there'll be a launch of a new service called the Pensions Dashboard, which will initially be available as a government service through the Money Helper service. It's a service provided by the government, and it's free. That will enable people to see how much state pension they're on track to have, all of the different private pensions that they have. It will express it as an annual income. So that'll be the first time that people will easily be able to see how much they're on track to have. Most people won't be on track to have enough, which will then give rise to another set of questions. Well, what can I do about it? How can I close the gap? At the moment, closing the gap involves getting information from companies like Scottish Widows, but then making your own decisions. Or at the other end of the spectrum, spending thousands of pounds per annum or getting a professional financial advisor to give you expert advice. There's nothing in between, or there hasn't been anything in between. The Financial Conduct Authority, that regulator we talked about a little while ago, are closing the gap in between. They're launching they're bringing in some new services, something called targeted support, something called simplified advice. And those are services which will either be free or an awful lot cheaper, which will help people make decisions. But there's a third ingredient in that the financial services industry is very siloed, as are government departments, which look at different aspects of financial services, so that conversations with people about equity in their home is a very different silo from conversations with people about pensions and ISAs. They're different regulatory permissions. It's different people you would speak to get that advice. And we need to bring those two permissions together, not just so that you can speak to an expert about about the two things collectively, but digital technology will increasingly democratize decision-making support for people. And the digital technology also needs to be able to have joined-up conversations about your housing equity and your pensions and ISAs. And at the moment, we've just got this big barrier that keeps those two things in silos that we need to knock down.
I think you touched on a really great point on how having that transparency of everything and bringing it all together can help so much. I mean, we've seen it a lot with, say, for example, when a lot of the challenger banks came out in, releasing apps that allowed you to kind of get all of these different insights in a very clear, easy to read thing on your phone. And it's easy to see, okay, this is going here, this is going there. With open banking, you could maybe put some other bank accounts that you had or credit card providers and just have it all in one place. And I think naturally that's given rise to people being a little bit more engaged and having a better understanding. So hopefully, if the pensions dashboard does go in this way, we will see something similar where it's like, okay, I have a clearer view of what's going on and feel a bit more empowered in how to take action. In the interim, and for anybody who's listening and they're like, okay, no, the alarm bells are ringing. I need to take action. What do I do? What is the first step that they, should really take in trying to get a picture of what's going on for their particular, pension scenario? And then what happens next from there?
Well, there's two sides to figuring out, are you on course to have the retirement that you want? The first thing is to try and picture the retirement that you want. Try and put that down in terms of, your housing situation, your housing bills, what sort of car or cars are you hoping to run, what type of holiday, frequency of holidays you're hoping to have, how often do you want to eat out, have takeaways, all of these sorts of things. Try and build up a bit of a cash flow model. How much am I going to need to spend each month, after tax? And then you need to kind of work back from that to say, well, how much income am I going to need to have, and where might that come from? Now, the first thing you want to do is figure out, well, how much pension income am I going to have? Before the pension dashboards come along, you can still log on to a government website and find out how much state pension you're on track to have. And you can still write to the private pension companies that you have products with, often arranged through your employer. You can write to each of them. Some of them will have online services, and you can find out how much you're on track to have. So at the moment, it is still possible to track all of that down. It's just a fair bit of effort, whereas pension dashboards next year will take away all of the effort and all of the pain, and that you'll be able to log on and just see it all in one place. So it's not too long to wait. You can get the information today. It'll just be easier to get it next year.
Absolutely. And for anybody who might be sort of midway through their career or, retirement is slightly closer, how can they start thinking about conversations about pensions, particularly if they've not really thought about it before? The pension auto-enrollment only came in 2012. So potentially there are, groups of people who have just kind of let it tick on in the background. And it's like, well, that's taken care of. I don't need to worry about it. And if today or tomorrow they looked at their pension statement and they were like, okay, I don't think I'm on track. How do you course correct from that point without panicking too much?
Well, you should never panic. There's always options. But it's that snowball thing I talked about earlier. Because if you're in your late 50s and you're starting to think about how much can I put away, that snowball's not going to get very big because it's not going to have very long to roll down the hill. So it's much harder to course correct, when you're trying to start your course correction in your mid to late 50s or later. That's just a fact. You tend to be wealthier on average. You tend to have a higher income in later life than you do in younger years. I mean, not everyone's career is linear these days, but on average, people have a bit more income later in life, and the kids may have flown the nest, and your household bills may be lower. So you can certainly put more into a pension. There's tax benefits to saving into a pension. So if you're just putting the money into a bank account, it's not getting investment growth, it's not getting tax relief, etc. So there's tax benefits, tax efficiencies. There's the employer matching of contributions. See how much extra the employer will match. I wouldn't encourage people later in life to take too much investment risk because the returns, although they might look a bit sexier, will tend to be more volatile. And that volatility means your returns go up and as well and down, and you don't want them to have a big downturn just as you're about to retire. So I wouldn't encourage people to take too much investment risk later in life. But for some people, the answer will be that they'll have to work for longer in some shape or form. Now, that doesn't have to be working flat out in a heavy-duty manual job or a very stressful managerial job full-time for the rest of your life. If you can figure out how much pension and other investment income you might have, you can figure out the gap that you need to close. And it may be that you could take a part-time job doing something enjoyable, or you could take contract work for 3 to 6 months in the year and maybe go off, to Spain and have a bit of a break for a few months in the winter, wherever where it's warmer. So I think for a lot of people, working longer will be part of the mix in terms of retirement income, but it doesn't have to be doing the job you're currently doing, full time forever.
And for anybody who's potentially thinking about continuing to work, but potentially drawing their pension as well. So, sort of staggering their retirement and doing a bit of both. What types of things should they factor into that decision? And at what point is it important to maybe seek professional, advice, just to make sure that you're not getting caught out by any extra, taxes that you might have to pay, or things that might just reduce what you have to live on throughout your retirement years?
So there's two ends to that spectrum. There's low-income households and very high-income households. So let's start with the low-income households. People in low-income households may be entitled to other benefits while they're working, and there's a different range of in-retirement benefits. And many of those are means tested. And if you start to take a small level of pension income, that will be added to your other sources of income, and it may push you above the limit where you're then entitled to those mean-tested benefits. So you could end up losing out on more benefits than the additional income that you've decided to take. So if you're in a low-income household that's in receipt of means-tested benefits, have a think about that before you start to take a little bit of extra income in case it pushes you over an unhelpful trigger point. If you're in a high-income household, the level of tax that you pay, income tax, is based on the income that you're getting from earned income and the income from potentially state pension, well, if you're at that age, and private pension. So you add it all up, and then you're paying tax at your marginal rate. If you're taking an income at a time when you don't need that income, you're probably paying an excessive rate of tax. And you'd probably be better to delay taking money out of the pension until points when you actually need it, maybe when you've got less or no earned income. And then, of course, you'll be paying a lot less tax. So don't just switch on an income and leave it there. It could be denying you benefits you're entitled to, or you could end up paying a lot more tax than you need to.
Absolutely. So with people kind of thinking about these different things, sometimes it can feel a little bit overwhelming. There's sometimes quite a lot of numbers and they can be a bit tricky to crunch. Is there a sort of stage at which it's better to kind of reach out to maybe your employer to see if they offer, like a financial advisor, or reaching out to your pension scheme even to see what options are available and whether or not this is the right thing for you? And then, at what point would it be wise to maybe think about professional financial advice, which obviously comes with, an additional fee?
Yeah. So have a look and see what's there. You mentioned various sources of support. It depends on the employer. Very big employers often do have websites with a lot of help on the whole thought process around and the journey into retirement, but not all. Some pension schemes have a lot of tools and calculators and guides, but again, not all. So have a look around. If your pension provider doesn't have that, a lot of these services are available on other pension providers' websites, and they're free to use. They won't have details of your specific, pension pot because you're not with them, but a lot of the tools and calculators are generic. In terms of getting a professional financial advisor to support you, because the charges are quite high at the moment, this is a very, very rough rule of thumb, but financial advisors usually think it's worthwhile helping you if you have about $250,000 in investable assets. So that would be across pensions, ISAs, other stocks and shares, etc. So if you're in that sort of territory, it's probably worthwhile getting the support of a professional financial advisor. If you've got a lot less than that, the government has a free-to-use service, so you can phone them, and they've got services on the web as well. It's called Money Helper. It's the brand. It's operated by the Money and Pension Service, and their services are free to use, and they can help you with some of these decisions and give you information as well.
That is very, very helpful. And I guess we've touched on a lot of different areas about pensions and how to make sure that you are supported. I suppose it would be great to kind of hear your perspective on how well do you think everything at the moment is going, and what would you like to see outside of the pensions dashboard to kind of help people feel more engaged and more empowered in making sure that they've got enough to afford the retirement lifestyle that they want?
I think it's a combination of more on the default side and more on the help. So if we think back to the time of the last pension commission, only about a third of employers had a pension scheme for their workers. And only about a third of the workers with those employers joined that scheme. So that was about a third and a third. We've now got 100% of employers that have set up a pension scheme, and 90% of those workers are in. So that's brilliant. And that was all done by nudging people into the correct behaviours. And people generally think, well, if the government and my employer have sort of defaulted me and nudged me into this, it must be a good thing. And most people go with it. So I think we should be doing more of that. We need to get that 8% up to 12% for employed people. And we need to create a similar mechanism that just defaults self-employed people into the right behaviours. And the research and prototyping we've done suggests the self-employed would go with that too if we default them and nudge them into the right thing. The second bit is we need to bring down the cost of engagement, and we need to make it more fun. We've got a bunch of rules from the industry regulators and the government prescribe the way that we can interact with pension customers and other investors. And a lot of that's to keep them safe from being exploited by sort of very clever financial services firms that in the past were trying to give them products that they didn't need or weren't great value. Hopefully, as an industry, we don't do that in the modern era. But a lot of those rules date back to that era. They also date back to when people got bits of paper from the financial services industry, so it was printed and it wasn't flexible. Technology now allows us to have all sorts of creative ways of engaging people. We can be much more intuitive, and we can actually make it fun through techniques such as gamification. And we can access influencers who different cohorts of the population respect, because not everybody respects someone from a pensions company. We could be seen as a bit dry and boring. You can probably tell that from our voice. But, we can work with people that, that people respect and trust as well to get messages across. And what we're seeing increasingly from government and regulators is a move away from hard and fast rules designed for the old paper-based era to allow us, it's a more principles-based approach, they call it, but it allows us much more space to be flexible and clever in how we engage people. So that's a good direction of travel. We're supportive of it.
Amazing. And I think that does kind of really solidify what we've talked about in terms of making sure that things can be flexible and have the ability to change as people's lifestyles are changing. The workforce has changed so much. The way that people approach careers has changed so much. And the expenses and how much things cost has changed significantly too. So hopefully with all of these things coming together, it does just bridge the gap and make it that much easier to feel empowered with your pension. Before we kind of close off the episode, is there one piece of pensions advice that you kind of wish everybody knew, or you think would kind of just help people, again, just feel a bit more empowered in managing their retirement income?
I think we just need to bust a few myths, if you like. There's myths that pensions are very expensive. There's lots of charges being taken out. The reality is that there's a charge cap of 0.75%, and most charges applying to workplace pensions are in the region of 0.3 to 0.4%. It's very small these days, so that's a myth that sometimes puts people off. People don't understand that there's tax relief. It's by far the most tax-efficient way of saving. People also think that pensions are risky because the money's invested. But if you leave your money in a bank account and there's no investment returns, the value of that money is decreasing in line with inflation. So let's say inflation is running at 5% per annum. After about 3 or 4 years, you've lost about 20% of the value. You're absolutely losing money in real terms, leaving it sitting in a bank. That's the most risky thing you could do if that money is intended for the long term. So we need people to understand that, pensions aren't expensive. There isn't the amount of risk attached to investments as people think, especially not as compared to a bank account. So those would be good myths to bust. So.
Well, Pete, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really great. And there have been so many insightful tips that I think are going to help people just feel a bit more comfortable when it comes to pensions. They can feel a bit far off or just not that easy to engage with. But I think when you break it down and just think about things, and hopefully when the pensions dashboard does come into play as well, it's going to make it that much easier.
I hope so.
Thank you so much for joining our Investing Insiders podcast. If you like the episode, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review on your platform of choice. For the latest money news and deals, you can sign up to our weekly newsletter at investinginsiders.co.uk/newsletter-page. We've also got a suite of guides, tools, and calculators on our website at investinginsiders.co.uk. You can also keep up to date with us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you in the next episode.